A personal trainer, a fit, young, athletic man, caught the train into work every day. Around the train station and in the doorways of the buildings on his way to his office, there were many homeless people. Sometimes he would give a bit of spare change, other times he would quickly pass by. There was one lady that intrigued him. She never asked for money. He was well groomed and many of the other homeless people thought he had money. He was often met with hostility when he didn't help. All this lady would say as he passed by was, "God bless you." So he decided one day to stop and talk. She'd been in and out of care all her life, never really had a chance, and wound up on the streets. She didn't look for sympathy, she didn't ask for help. So the young man decided to take her out for a meal in a local restaurant. The local restaurant, he told her that she could order whatever she wanted on the menu. He was concerned it might be a large bill, but the lady looked hesitant to order anything. It was then that she confessed she couldn't read. She'd been in and out of school, never learned, and was even unable to read this simple menu. Whenever she went for a job interview, she was turned down because of her illiteracy. It was not that she didn't want to work. She did, but she couldn't read. The man went home, and that night he decided that he could do something about this. He went to the local library, borrowed some books, met with the lady on a regular basis, taking her out for a meal each time, teaching her to read and setting her homework until the next meeting. Sometimes his wife and even his daughter would join him. This became a family mission. Initially, the restaurant they met to do their English lessons in was a bit hostile to a homeless woman coming in on a regular basis. It might put off their other clients. But when they began to understand what was happening, the staff began to help, sometimes paying for the food, always helping the lady with her reading. As her proficiency increased, the young man organised a flat to rent. She applied for and got a job because she could read. She is off the streets, now able to look after herself. The young man, his wife and his daughter visit most weeks. One woman's life changed by one man who wanted to live excellently. Romans 12 and 13 are about living excellently. What does it mean to love your neighbour as yourself? And I want to suggest that Romans 13 calls us to walk humbly, verses 1 to 7, love generously, verses 8 to 10, and hope passionately, verses 11 to 14. The first thing that we're to do if we're to live excellently is to walk humbly. The first 7 verses cannot be read without recognizing we read these verses with the horror of Hitler, Stalin, Chairman Mao, Pol Pot, Idi Amin at the forefront of our minds. Dictators who has the blood of many people on their hands. We cannot shape what is happening to our persecuted brothers and sisters in places like North Korea, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya and Pakistan, and the list could go on. There is a natural revulsion to the words of Paul. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Does the blood of the former dictators and the suffering saints in persecuted lands cover the hands of God with blood? It's important to realize the context Paul is writing in. In the 2nd century BC, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV sought to eradicate the Jews by banning the Torah, and it led to the Maccabean revolt. And as he writes, their hatred of Roman occupation and rebellion and revolt fill the air that will culminate in the tax revolt of AD 58. Paul is accused in Acts 21:38 of being an Egyptian terrorist. Paul is writing in a context where it's not easy to write what he's just written. He knows what bad government looks like. Yet he still writes, the authorities that exist have been established by God. What he's arguing is that if we're to live excellently, we are to walk humbly. In the first couple of verses, he outlines the individual's response. Humility involves submission, and the word means placing oneself under someone. It was usually used in the context of a person's relationship with God out of honor for God. In relation to authorities, we hold them and their work in high esteem and humble ourselves to make them more able to fulfill their role of governing wisely. Now, we live in a context where those in power are fair game for mockery and ridicule. And that challenges us in light of this passage, that do we walk humbly and therefore respectfully of those in authority? It's something we need to guard against because of verse 2. Rebelling against authority because of our personal whims and personal political proclivities fails to honour God. The criticism of what's happening in Manchester by the elected mayor is that he doesn't necessarily want the best for Manchester, but the advancement of his own political ends. He wants to give the government a bloody nose. And if we're critical, perhaps people will die as a result of what's happening. A godly response as one of seeking to fulfill what the government is trying to do. It's not that we're unthinking, blind, docile, mindlessly conforming, but our response has always got to be measured against bringing honour to God, which unguarded criticism does not. Yet we scratch our heads when the conservative right in America see Trump as God's mouthpiece. We understand how this passage can advocate such a response, yet God uses the proud and arrogant. He uses the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar and the Persian king Cyrus to carry out what God wanted. Sometimes that simply means God removes his restraining hands that have held back all the consequences of the sin of God's people, and they receive what they deserve as a result of their rebellion. They've chosen not to honour God, and so he removes his hand. We stand under the authority of those in leadership over us. Our response is one of humility, and even though there is a recognition that God stands behind rulers, even secular rulers, sometimes they need to be resisted. Sometimes it needs to be the church that takes a stand against illegal, immoral, and ungodly rule. Yet our default position is one of humility. It's an incredibly hard balance to strike, to honour those God has ordained for leadership, while at the same time be a prophetic voice into their leadership. The verse moves on to talk about what leaders should be like. It's here we know that Paul is talking about ideal governing authorities. The key thing is the two words that are repeated 3 times. They honour what is right and punish what is wrong. This is the essential and constructive purpose of government. These servants of God should be servants of their people and allow people to flourish through the reign of justice. Even in a less than ideal situation, Jeremiah reminds people, seek the peace and prosperity to the city of which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. The challenge for us, no matter what our personal political persuasion, that we pray for righteousness and just leadership. Where leadership goes rotten, it's when a position of power becomes a vehicle for promoting self, of advancing cronies and their interests, of allowing bribery and corruption to go unchallenged. Paul challenges all leadership to honour what is righteous and punish what is wrong. I read an article written to describe the historic development of the mills of Bingley. Effectively, the town council will be presided over by a mill owner that wanted to build a mill. Once he had planning permission for his mill to be built, he stepped down and the next mill owner would stand up until his building proposals had been passed. Those in leadership and involved in the political processes of our country and indeed the world need our prayer, because it's very easy to fall short of the ideal Paul is talking about. I sometimes fear in our own country that if God removes his restraining hand, we'll get the leadership our sin deserves. Oh God, have mercy on us. How God's people need to pray for the government of this country. Paul goes on to describe the two reasons we submit. If we don't, we may be punished, and this would be very real over the next few centuries as Christians were singled out for persecution. They were considered to undermine the rule of law. It was a matter of self-preservation to be a good citizen. But Paul also mentions conscience. What really mattered was the high calling we have to walk humbly. Those that agitated against the present governing authorities could easily say they're responding out of good conscience. Yet the consciences often were hard as they served their own ends, their own interpretation of what should be. Humility enabled the believer's conscience to stay responsive. Are our consciences sensitive to how we are behaving as participators in society? It even challenges us in the church meeting. If a decision is made that goes against what we want, can we humbly accept that decision, or do we keep on revisiting it or agitating to get what we want? We are called to walk humbly if we are to live excellently. One of the tests in this area we might not like. Paul then moves on to talk about taxes. No one likes taxes, but everyone likes the services they pay for. There was a brewing storm as Paul was writing over the high taxes everyone was paying. Everyone hated it. Yet into this melting pot, Paul says that we are to walk humbly. We pay our taxes to facilitate the services that they run. And Paul underscores this again with a call to a right attitude. We do not pay taxes grudgingly, but with respect and honour. The criticism of public service is that vast resources are squandered, that we don't want to pay our taxes. There's a prevailing attitude where we sue our public services for negligence as an anonymous body that hurts no one, not recognising that increases the taxes everyone has to pay. It's a bizarre world we live in where we don't honour those in service over us. Perhaps we need a fresh challenge, the challenge of Romans 13, in our response to walking humbly in the life we're called to live. The second thing we are to do if we are to live excellently, is to love generously. An old man was a regular in a restaurant. He was rude and difficult, and no one really liked serving him. A new waiter started, and she was warned about the man, but she determined that she was going to respond well to him. Week after week, month after month, she was always polite, always asked after him and his week, no matter what he threw back her way. She always came back with kindness. This went on for several years. Then one week, the man didn't turn up for his regular meal. The waiter made some inquiries. She was concerned that he might not be well, but in fact, he had died. She was a little upset and decided to attend the funeral. There was absolutely no one there. After the funeral, she was approached by a man. It was, in fact, the man's lawyer. He'd left his entire estate to her, as she was the only one who'd ever shown him love in this world. The lady didn't love to get back. She loved because it was the right thing to do. Paul says that we're not to be people who constantly run around saddled by debt. The only debt that we want is the debt of loving one another deeply. Loving other people is the visible expression of our faith. The story of the Good Samaritan reminds us of who is our neighbour. It is simply the person we can be neighbourly towards. If another human being stands before us, they are our neighbour and someone in need of loving. This love is an action. Expressed in verse 10, it's an absence of a negative. It does not harm, yet it's more than that. It is a choice to do something that blesses them. Love is always looking for a way to be generous. As soon as we begin to explore this, we want God to work in our hearts and increase our capacity to love others. Help us to be a blessing to any and all we can be a blessing to. We recognize that there is such great scope to improve in living excellently. The third thing we are to do if we're to walk excellently is to hope passionately. In this COVID era, many of us are feeling worn out. We're fed up with face masks, restrictions as to who we can meet, the frustrations imposed on worship and fellowship when we do meet. When will it end? And that often is the debilitating factor. We don't know when the end will be. If we knew it would be all over by Christmas, we'd tighten our belts, renew our determination, and in a heroic English fashion, stiff off our lip our way through the next couple of months. But we don't know, and it's demotivating. Jesus talked of his return. People thought it was imminent, but as the months rolled into years, people were becoming discouraged. Their pace and determination was slacking, and they were allowing all sorts of behaviour to creep back in. They had fallen asleep. Wake up! All sorts of behaviours were beginning to become normal again in the lives of the believers. The world was exerting an influence on them, was enticing them back to that old style living. They were slackening their pace because what did it matter? Yet Paul reminds them that they need to clothe themselves, to put on their spiritual armour, to walk in the light with renewed determination. The date and the time might not be known, but each day was a day nearer to the day in which Jesus would return. There was a need for urgency. Wake up! There was a need to get rid of all darkness and pursue a holy and godly life. Wake up! There was a need to be deliberate and with renewed determination live with hope in our hearts and not resigned acquiescence to the ways of the world. Wake up! As we look at Romans 13 and living excellently, perhaps God is speaking to us this evening that we need to wake up. There's an area in our life that the Spirit is saying, wake up to. We've slackened our pace. we've gone cold. We've allowed things to creep in that should never be there. Wake up. Perhaps God is saying, wake up to walking humbly. Wake up to loving generously. Wake up to hoping passionately. Let's give ourselves a few minutes to allow the Holy Spirit to speak to us and reflect on what we've just heard. And so we're going to respond as we hear a song that perhaps we don't know, Wake Up Sleeper, and just allow this time to be still before the Lord and continue hearing what the Spirit may be saying to us.